This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.
Welcome to the second weekly podcast from the staff of Editor and Publisher Magazine, E&P Reports. I'm your host, Bob Andelman. Every week, we'll open the show with the latest news publishing industry headlines from the E&P newsroom, delivered from our Fountain Valley, California editorial offices by Editor-in-Chief Nu Yang or Managing Editor Evelyn Mateos. Some weeks we'll have a breaking news report, as we do today with the Poynter Institute's senior media writer Tom Jones, who joins me from St. Petersburg, Florida, to talk about the New York Times' controversial decision to release previously secret identifying characteristics of the White House whistleblower who inadvertently set the gears of President Donald Trump's impeachment inquiry in motion. Then we'll present our main feature, an interview with a news publishing influencer. This week, it's cartoonist Lynn Johnston, whose daily comic strip celebrates its 40th year in print in September 2019. By the way, this show is available for free as both an audio podcast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Castro, Luminary, and pretty much anywhere else you can find your favorite shows. It's also available as a free video podcast on Editor and Publisher Magazine's YouTube channel. Whether you watch or listen, we hope you'll still subscribe, leave a rating, and other comments. But first, here is Editor and Publisher Editor-in-Chief Nu Yang with the week's headlines.
Thanks, Bob. This week, The Verge revealed 2 hours of leaked audio from Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, where he spoke about the company's competitors, critics, and the U.S. government. In one clip, Zuckerberg said, "You have someone like Elizabeth Warren who thinks that the right answer is to break up the companies. If she gets elected president, then I would bet that we will have a legal challenge. And I would bet that we will win the legal challenge. And does that still suck for us? Yeah. I mean, I don't want to have a major lawsuit against our own government." To which Warren responded in a tweet, "What would really suck is if we don't fix a corrupt system that lets giant companies like Facebook engage in illegal anti-competitive practices, stomp on consumer privacy rights, and repeatedly fumble their responsibility to protect our democracy." This week also marks the 1-year anniversary death of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi. Khashoggi was killed inside Saudi Arabia's consulate in Istanbul, and although Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman denies ordering the murder, he told 60 Minutes in a recent interview he took full responsibility because the act was committed by Saudi government employees. At E&P, our cover story, taken on the tech giants, was published on our website yesterday. So be sure to check out next week's podcast, where writer Rob Turno will speak more in detail about the Journalism, Competition, and Preservation Act with News Media Alliance President and CEO David Chapman. Another reason why you don't want to miss next week's podcast is that we'll reveal a 2019 Publisher of the Year. We're truly excited about the person we selected. Next week, E&P will be in Chicago at the SMPA Inland Press Association joint annual meeting. The two groups officially merged on October 1st, and a new association's name will be announced at the meeting. If you're going to be in Chicago, make sure to say hi to our new owner, Mike Blunder, who will also be in attendance. As always, please check out our website for the latest headlines and news publishing, and make sure to subscribe to our free daily e-newsletter.
Thank you, Nu. Now let's turn to our breaking news story this week, the controversial decision by the New York Times to publish revealing details about the identity of the White House whistleblower, whose classified report on President Trump's conversation with Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky pushed House Speaker Nancy Pelosi over the line from waffling on an impeachment inquiry to being all in. Tom Jones, senior media writer for the Poynter Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida, wrote about this development in his September 7th online newsletter, this titled Blowing the Whistle on the Whistleblower. And I asked Tom to join us to talk about it. Tom, thanks for joining us. Tom, can you set the scene for anyone who may have been in hibernation last week and doesn't understand what made the New York Times decision at all controversial?
Yeah, I think what made the New York Times decision somewhat controversial is that they were revealing what everybody thought was the whistleblower who's supposed to be anonymous. I mean, there's this assumption that when you're a whistleblower that your anonymity is guaranteed. But first off, that's not actually the case. But in this particular situation, there were a lot of critics of the New York Times who said that by revealing whatever details that they did, and they didn't go as far as naming the name, but there were enough details there that maybe some people would be able to put two and two together and start to figure out who this whistleblower was, that they were somehow putting this whistleblower in jeopardy, his or her safety. And the lawyer for the whistleblower implied as much, that the safety of this whistleblower could be in jeopardy. And President Trump made some threatening remarks on Twitter as well that got a lot of people fired up. So I think the question ultimately was the Times irresponsible in naming as much as they did about the whistleblower and therefore jeopardizing his safety in some way?
In some ways, I understand them revealing some details, but it coming on the same day that the president, not just on Twitter, but in video, out on the White House lawn, talked about how maybe it wasn't quite on the lawn, but he talked about how in the old days we handled traitors differently. I mean, so before the New York Times reveal of what details that they offered, he literally threatened the life of this person, which I think if that had not happened, the Times decision wouldn't be as controversial. Would you agree?
I agree with that. I think that is the biggest criticism they got, was the fact that President Trump had said some remarks. Now, whether those remarks were to be taken seriously, I don't know, but I'm not sure at the end of the day that that's the New York Times' responsibility. I think the New York Times is in the business of giving as much information as it can to its readers. Now, I talked to Al Tompkins. He's a senior faculty member here, guy I respect greatly at Poynter. His conversation with me is, because the reason the Times would bring this up and reveal as much as they could is it goes to the credibility of the whistleblower. Who is the whistleblower? Is it somebody that we can believe in? Would they have credible information? Would they know what's going on inside the White House? And Al Tompkins, to me, said, it isn't the credibility of the whistleblower that we should care about. It's the credibility of the information that the whistleblower had. And therefore, that eventually is going to come out. We're going to eventually find out what kind of information. Then we can verify the information. Who gave it hardly matters. Now, this is a very simplistic way to look at it. But let's say somebody is in an apartment and they hear something going on next door, some sort of disturbance, and they call the police and say, hey, I think there's something going on in the apartment next door. You should come check it out. At that point, it doesn't matter who the person who called the police was. It doesn't matter whether they're a doctor or it doesn't matter whether they're a drug dealer. All it matters is what kind of information are they giving. Once the police get there, they can then investigate what's going on inside that apartment next door. How they got there really doesn't matter. It's what they find once they got there. Now, again, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. I think it's much more complicated and nuanced than that. But Al's point was, it's the information we should care about, not who gave that information. So that's one argument that's for not naming as much as you can about the whistleblower. My other argument to the other side of that is, I still think credibility is an issue here. Are we talking about somebody who legitimately knows what's going on inside the White House, would have privy to these conversations that President Trump allegedly had with Ukraine's president? Would he be privy to the details of those conversations? Was there a quid pro quo with the Ukraine president in terms of information on Joe Biden's son? So these are all things I think that have to be taken into account. I will also say this, that it's interesting that the New York Times came out with this story about a week ago now almost, or it was last week, and we still don't know the identity exactly of the whistleblower. So they didn't give away apparently so much information that it compromised who this whistleblower is.
Tom, as I recall, earlier in the same day that the New York Times revealed the details that it did, I remember on MSNBC and CNN, both made references to the whistleblower and acknowledged that they had information about who it was, but they had made decisions not to reveal that information. That it was one of those things that, among the press, it was sort of an open secret, kind of who the person was. But they also felt that, I think, because the president had made threatening comments and tweets about the person and thought that this person had committed treason and was a traitor, and we used to know how to treat people like that, that they were not revealing it. So. It made it all the more surprising, I think, that particular day that the New York Times revealed anything.
Right, and I think, if I'm correct, I think the Wall Street Journal actually confirmed the New York Times reporting. So they actually did go as far as the New York Times did in terms of revealing as much detail as they could without actually naming the whistleblower in this case. Now, again, we can go back and forth on whether the Times has journalistically, they did the right thing. Ethically, that's where we get a little more. It's a little more nuanced, a little more complicated. If, for example, it came down to an undercover agent, somebody who was or working for the military who was a spy. Would we reveal that person? Probably not in that situation. And the other more interesting thing here that I find, Bob, is that the New York Times routinely grants anonymity to sources. Now, remember, it almost seems like a lifetime ago, they ran an op-ed in the New York Times. Now, again, this is different. The editorial department's different from the news department, but they ran an op-ed from an anonymous person inside the White House, and it was an explosive thing, and they granted anonymity to this person. In this case, they did not basically grant anonymity to the whistleblower. Now, the difference is the information that they were able to get about the whistleblower, they gained independently. The op-ed, or anytime they use an unnamed source, they can't get that information in the paper otherwise unless they grant anonymity to that person. In this case, I keep going back to this fact is that I think the New York Times has a responsibility to its readers to give them as much information as they can. And I can't speak for Dean Baquet, the executive editor, and everybody else at the New York Times, but it's my assumption that they weren't putting the person's life in danger when they revealed. And I think there's this expectation that we're eventually going to find out who this whistleblower is anyway, because he's eventually going to have to testify.
Well, eventually. But
right.
Maybe on the day that he's threatened by the President of the United States is not the best day. And I want to point out that you and your column came out in favor of what they did, and Jack Schaefer at Politico also did an op-ed, an opinion piece, where he also believed that it was the right thing to do.
And just to interrupt real quick, Bob, because Jack said this in his piece, and I read Jack's piece, and I just said it a moment ago. I don't know that it's a good enough reason to say, well, it's eventually going to come out anyway. That's probably not a standard by which the New York Times should work on these things, is by saying, or that I should condone what they did by saying, well, we're eventually going to learn who it is anyway. You're right about that if this person's life is being threatened. I think it really comes down to whether we truly believe the president was threatening this whistleblower. And my assumption would be that the New York Times did not think that was the case. Now, they could be wrong, and maybe it's not just President Trump, but it might be other people who listen to President Trump, some of his supporters who might take things a little bit further than that. But I think my guess is the New York Times felt like they were revealing just enough information to let their readers know this is a credible source. This whistleblower isn't some person who has a peripheral understanding of what's going on. They're actually involved in it in a way. This person works for the CIA. They know what's going on. Well,
here's another reason that I felt uncomfortable with revealing details about the whistleblower. It has only been a couple of weeks since Jeffrey Epstein died behind bars in a very, it's not getting a lot of coverage now. It's 3 or 4 weeks out, but, it was very strange that Attorney General Barr had taken such close control and interest in that case, and who had a vested interest in whether Epstein was able to eventually testify against him, particularly about President Trump. And then, amazingly, cameras went out at the time that Epstein died, and suddenly there was a breakdown in procedure at this prison, and Epstein died. And so, in light of that, this very suspicious death, I think, of Jeffrey Epstein, who was who had evidence to be given about the President of the United States, to just a few weeks later have the President of the United States threatening the life of a whistleblower who's definitely threatening his presidency and was the straw that broke Pelosi's back in terms of coming around to impeachment. I have some issues with this. It just didn't seem appropriate, and there have been some other things that the Times has done in recent months that have seemed rather odd.
I will defend the Times in this way. Is I think the Times has their number one responsibility is to its readers. I know the Times gets heavily criticized, and there's a feeling that they should be more advocates than neutral observers when it comes to President Trump. I know that I frequently have gotten into it with Jay Rosen from New York University, who I have a great amount of respect for. But I feel like there are many people, including Jay, who feels like the Times needs to be a little bit more aggressive in its coverage of President Trump. And I think Dean Baquet has said we're not there to be necessarily advocates for fighting President Trump, but we're there to be neutral journalists who cover the president. And so I think if we look at it through the way Dean Baquet's looking at it, then I think we can understand a little bit better some of the decisions they make. Look, I talked to several people about the column I wrote, or about my newsletter when I wrote about the Times and the whistleblower. I talked to probably 7 or 8 people that I have a great amount of respect for, people who run newspapers, people like Al Tompkins who deal in ethics, Kelly McBride at the Poynter Institute, who's an authority on ethics. Every time I talked to somebody, there was a different answer. I came away, someone said, no, absolutely, you can't run it. And somebody else said, absolutely, you have to run it. What was interesting is the newspaper people I talked to, the people who have run newspapers were very much in favor of the Times running as much information as they could about the whistleblower. But then I do see the other side of this. I do understand. And the point that Al made that was pretty strong, and I probably should have included it more in the piece, is what's the rush? Why do we have to know that information necessarily right now? That could the New York Times have held off because this whistleblower, we're going to start finding out more and more in a couple of weeks. What's the point of finding? Was there a need? Is there a need for the public to know this minute? The New York Times would argue yes, that we're talking to our representatives in Washington as citizens, and if we feel like we find out that this person who was the whistleblower was worked for the Democratic Party at some point, or were Clinton supporters, or had some sort of agenda against the president, other than just being someone who said, "Hey, what's going on here is wrong." Should we take that into account? I think that's what the New York Times was trying to say here, was that we're going to give you as much information that this is a credible source. The other thing was that earlier in that day, or earlier in the story, President Trump tried to diminish the credibility of the whistleblower, saying, "I don't know, this person's not credible." The New York Times saying, by revealing what they did, a CIA agent, somebody who worked inside the White House, was basically answering Trump's claims of, no, this person is credible. And I think that's another reason why they decided to go ahead and run as much as they did.
Now, we both know from working in newspapers that newspapers hold off on stories all the time for either because they're still fact-checking, one reason, or because they're looking for the right day and time. Maybe it's just because they want it to be a Sunday lead, but also if they're, they've got a great breaking news story, whether it's the president or it's some local politics or, it's some scam breaking, they'll hold something for the right day and the right moment. So, I don't know about that. Now, the other, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think, the point you do make is look, there are a lot of, right now, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, of course there are others, those 3 are trading punches right now as far as getting scoops. It's been impressive to watch the journalism that all 3 of those news organizations are producing at this moment. Could you make an argument that the New York Times had a piece of information that nobody else had, and so they decided to go ahead and run it because they were the only ones that had it? That's not necessarily a good reason to run something, but it could have been part of the decision making that these reporters went out there and said, "Hey, we have found out who this is," or at least what their job was. And so the Wall Street Journal doesn't have it, the Post doesn't have it, we have it.
But they all had it. Right. That was the thing. Everybody had this. I mean, that's why I made the point before that MSNBC and CNN were very pointed in saying, we have this before the New York Times reported, we have this information. It's a known, it's a known or whatever. But we've all decided to respect the whistleblower's position and not report it. And that's what was interesting, that the New York Times jumped. Everyone had the information.
Well, the Wall Street Journal didn't have it until after the Times had it, and they went ahead and and ran it after the New York Times did.
So the other question I have is, I've got lots of questions, but it's the nature of the job. In all kinds of situations, from instances of of rape to even community zoning decisions, it's not uncommon for reporters to hold back the names of sources to protect their sources. Did papers have to have a policy that covers all situations, or can it be flexible to cover, hey, we have a scoop, so we're not going to follow our usual standard?
I think it has to be flexible. I think every situation is different. I think newspapers have to decide at times the information that we're going to get, is it worth granting anonymity to somebody? I mean, there are some times where people come to us, and you know this, Bob, that working in newspapers, somebody might come and say, hey, I got information on the mayor. The mayor's doing something fishy behind the scenes. In that case, again, as newspaper people, the first thing we do is, okay, how credible is the person? Mm-hmm. Is this person who works for the other mayor, the mayor who got voted out of office? Is this somebody who got fired by the mayor's office? Is this somebody that has a grudge? And then we take the information and say, okay, is this it? Well, we'll dig into the information. Now, it might be somebody who's working inside the mayor's office, somebody who's saying, look, I got this information. I'll continue, sort of a deep throat, if you will. I'll continue to feed you information, but you got to keep my name out of it. As long as you keep my name out of it, I'll keep giving you information. I think it's got to be taken on a case by case basis. The rape situations are a completely different set of ethics and much, it's hard to, those also too, I think are very much, a case by case, but I think in those situations, I think you have to err on the side of the survivors in those situations. But when it comes to like whistleblower information, I think it's a case by case situation.
Last question about this situation. Then I have some other thing I want to talk to you about. Could it be a problem? There's still time to time reporters are hauled into court because prosecutors want them to reveal their sources, and they hold back. Is there any connective tissue in the flexibility that newspapers might have in terms of their policy about what they reveal and what they don't, in terms of if they start getting pulled in front of more prosecutors or juries and they refuse? Could a prosecutor say, yeah, but you were pretty willing to reveal the sources in this case. Why not now?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think one thing that I think some people who aren't journalists don't realize is it's not a law. As far as journalists protecting their sources, that's something they do voluntarily. They're not forbidden from revealing their sources. You can go to jail. You can go for contempt of court. You can go to prison or go to jail for not revealing your sources. The reason that journalists don't reveal their sources is because they want to talk to other sources in the future. They don't want sources to feel like, oh, you're going to give me up once you get into a courtroom. And so that's why they don't do it. But it's an interesting question, Bob. Look, this whistleblower story it's not an easy one. Like I said, I talked to 7, 8, 9 different people about this. Everybody had a different answer. I changed my mind on it about 3 or 4 times. Clearly, I think you see this differently than I do. I thought the Times was okay to do it, but I don't feel 100% about it. It's a very complicated issue. And I think what makes it complicated, which you just mentioned, is I think we all agree that it's the part about is the whistleblower's safety in jeopardy. And at that point, if we really truly feel that the whistleblower's safety is in jeopardy, then that's where a newspaper has to seriously consider, is doing the right thing ethically and morally more important than doing the right thing journalistically.
Well, it makes for a good conversation, and I certainly know here, with the E&P Reports, we want to have those conversations. My intention is not to criticize you or Poynter.
Oh, no.
I think Poynter has always been a great arbiter of these types of ethical situations, which is why I thought you would be a really good person to have on to discuss.
And I'm not sure I answered any of the questions. It truly is a very complicated issue that I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer on this.
Well, before we let you go, I wanted to talk to you about your job. How long has it been now since you've left the Tampa Bay Times as a sports writer and joined Poynter as the senior media guy?
Yeah, I started January 2nd, so the first of this year. I'd been a sports writer for 30 years, sports columnist for the last 10 years, enjoyed it, covered a lot of sports media, which is what got me interested in the media. And then the first of this year, late last year, we began talking about coming over to Poynter to write a media column. The daily newsletter had been something that and now it's called the Poynter Report, which is what I write. So plug here. Hope everybody can go to poynter.org and sign up for it. But it's something they were looking to spruce up, and so I do that as well as write features on poynter.org about the media, and I'm thrilled. It's an interesting time in our country because the media is such a, on one hand, I felt a calling to come over here because journalism is being attacked not only by the president, but by a lot of people out there. And I thought it's an important institution that we need to protect. But it's also, I think, important to continue to be a watchdog to the media as we see TV, cable news networks go in different directions and become more about opinion than news. And we have these discussions about places like the New York Times where for years and years, we never would have questioned anything that the New York Times might have done in terms of putting information in the paper. But it's a right time to be writing about the media, and I'm really enjoying it.
Well, you're a damn good sports writer and columnist.
Thank you.
I'm one of those people who, the Tempe Times is my paper that gets delivered, and I think I would say that I read you every day. What was the hardest part, and what was the easiest part about your transition to this role?
The hardest part, Bob, I tell you, is the stakes are much higher now than they were before. And I'm not saying that, it's in sports. I took sports very seriously, and I wrote about important topics besides just games. When you're writing about people like Colin Kaepernick and talking about protests and talking about how African-American athletes are treated and talking about how women are treated in sports. So we did deal with important issues there. But a lot of the days it was just about a game, and it was just about whether this guy should be the starting quarterback and whether that coach should be fired or whether this player should be traded. And if you're wrong, big deal. It's sports, right? Now the stakes are much higher when you criticize media outfits, when you criticize our leaders. It comes with a much higher responsibility. And so I think I have to be much more careful. Not that I wasn't careful in sports, but I certainly had a great command of what I was writing about in sports. In the media now, it takes a little more concentration. You have to be a little more careful with your words than I was. So that's been the hardest thing. The easiest thing, though, is it's still the basic things that we do every day. We report, we call people, we talk to people, we get as much information as I can, and then right from there. The easy part is that it's Poynter has a bit of a name, so when I reach out to people, they get back to me, which is nice. But it's been a lot harder than I thought, but it's been a lot more rewarding than I hoped it would be.
I'll let you in on a secret. When Romanesco left years ago, I was one of the guys who came in and did a week-long tryout.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was fun.
And Jim obviously has a great legacy here at Poynter, and it's and the newsletter, it's that's the other thing. It's like I just write this newsletter every day, and people say, "What else do you do?" And I'm like, "That's will you trust me? That takes up all of my day."
Oh, I'm
sure.
It's
a lot of work.
You think you'd ever want to go back to sports, or is that chapter closed?
I think that chapter is closed. I would never say never. I really enjoy it. The thing is, I don't like a lot of things have happened in the Tampa Bay sports scene over the last even in the last couple of weeks here, but certainly over the last year with the baseball teams making the playoffs and the hockey team's pretty good here, and the football team looks like they're showing signs of getting better. But at no point have I watched anything and said, "Oh, I really miss it." I miss the people. I miss the people I worked with, but I don't miss the games. I don't miss writing sports columns. And like I said, I feel like I'm getting better and better every day with the media column at Poynter, and I'm really starting to get my footing underneath me in terms of what I'm writing here. So I would never say never, but I'm pretty pleased with where I am right now.
All right. Well, folks, you can read Tom Jones's daily column at poynter.org, and definitely want to subscribe to that daily. It'll be delivered. You'll get it every morning. It'll be there. You don't have to go looking for it, right?
And like Bluto said in Animal House, it don't cost nothing. So.
Excellent. Hey, Tom, thank you so much for talking to us straightforwardly and joining us on E&P Reports today.
Thanks, Bob.
On today's show, I'll talk to syndicated cartoonist Lynn Johnston, creator of the long-running family comic strip For Better or For Worse. It blows my mind to say that her sweet family story is celebrating its 40th year in print. Stick around. Well, I can't tell you that I have read Lynn Johnston's wonderful daily comic strip, For Better or For Worse, from the very beginning in 1979. I can't remember a time when the Patterson family was not a part of my own family. I was a college sophomore when Lynn started. I remember becoming immediately attached to John and Ellie's daily adventures, raising their children, Michael and Elizabeth, their dog, Farley, getting to know their extended family, such as when Grandpa Jim started dating again, and even the heartbreaking death of Farley. When Mimi and I got married, we often read the strip together in the morning or shared a favorite. When Charlie was born, I related to the Patterson kids in new ways. And when Charlie started reading at 4, I introduced him to collections of For Better or For Worse, which he devoured over and over again. On any given day, For Better or For Worse could be funny, sweet, bittersweet, or hauntingly dramatic, just like life in my own family or yours. Perhaps nothing about the strip was more shocking than the day in 2008 that Lynn announced she would no longer be producing new strips, but would be re-releasing the original strip from day one with occasional fixes to continuity and timeliness. And we all asked ourselves, would that even work? Well, it has, and it does, with the strip continuing to appear in an astonishing 2,000 newspapers in 23 countries around the world. Now, we are conducting this interview just days after learning of the sudden death of the former editor of Universal Press Syndicate, Lee Salem, who I believe was a friend of both of ours. And here is something that Lynn and I have in common. Salem acquired both For Better or For Worse and Mr. Media, which started life in 1994 as a weekly syndicated newspaper column. And let's just say that For Better or For Worse had a long and much more successful run with it. But Lynn Johnston, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. It's so nice to meet you. I've been a big admirer of your work for so long, and years. Does that blow your mind?
Well, it does. In fact, it was my daughter, and there's a wonderful gal that does our website, and they both reminded me, and I was surprised. Yeah, 40 years. Well, so many years have gone by. I don't even recognize my image in the mirror now. So.
Oh. Well, you look great. don't sweat that.
What can you say?
You originally signed, as I read, a contract for 20 years, right?
I did. Right. That was in 1979, and I started to work with Lee right away, developing a strip because I really had not come up with any characters that were consistent, and so he helped me all the way through that first 6 months as we developed the strip. And fax machines had just really been perfected. Everybody had a fax machine. Very grateful for that. And living almost in an Arctic community at the time. So it was an interesting job at home with a company in Kansas hitting a worldwide market. Wow.
And do I understand that he literally discovered you in the sense that he found your work and came to you and suggested something? Or how?
No, I had done 3 little books on pregnancy, childbirth, raising little kids, and they were published by a Minneapolis company, and that publisher sent them to Universal Press. Oh. And it was Jim Andrews, actually, of Andrews McMeel, who thought maybe I would have potential. So they asked me to produce 21 comic strips as quickly as possible, like 3 weeks worth. And I think they wanted to just put the pressure on to see how quickly I could produce. I think they do that to just about everybody. And they liked what I sent them, and they sent me a 20-year contract. And off I went to meet everybody in Kansas, and couldn't believe I would be fully employed as a cartoonist, which is a pretty rare gift.
What were you thinking when you saw 20 years?
I was terrified. I really did not want to sign the contract. I mean, if you've got the gift, you can be funny once in a while, but every single day for 365 days and for 20 years. And I also didn't have anybody to go over the contract with me. So I had to trust that contract was in my best interest, and of course theirs, of course. And I watched my right hand sign that contract. They left me alone at a big rosewood table with this 20-year contract, which I signed. But I was very lucky to work with a very good company. It was a great company to work with. Still is.
And people in the industry know who was there. But, I mean, I think at the time, Gary Larson was still doing The Far Side, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And Gary Trudeau was doing Doonesbury.
Yeah. And Herman and Kathy. And, I mean, what a great group of people. And we all got to know each other quite well. In fact, Kathy was the first person I talked to. Lee gave me her home phone number, and she was gracious enough to have a nice long conversation and sort of tell me how she worked, the way she managed. I mean, coming up with ideas is the one thing we all ask each other about. I mean, how do you do it? Where do you do it? Sparky Schultz used to sit and doodle on yellow legal pads, but I like to sit on a couch with a coffee and a pad on my lap. And Kathy said the thing that helped her the most was to write vignettes, as if she was writing for a play, like a short 4-panel play. And I found that worked the best for me.
And you want to just make clear what Kathy we're talking about?
Kathy Geiswhite has done a strip called Kathy for many, many, many years. And she also suggested I not call the strip The Johnstons, because she said, I have really wondered if it was a good idea to call the strip Kathy, because she was so closely connected to it. And really, I mean, even if the characters look like you or your family, it's all pretty well made up.
And I think I read that only Ellie... Right. Only Ellie's name is actually the real person that she's representing. Everyone else's name has been changed from what you originally planned.
Everybody has the second name, like my
middle names, right?
My husband's name was John Roderick, but he went by the name Roderick, so we used the name John. My son was Aaron Michael. My daughter was Catherine Elizabeth. Everybody had the second name, but Ellie was she was such a profound character, and I couldn't really identify her 100% with myself, but I wanted to think of her with a certain affection that transcended reality. And I named her for a friend of mine who died when we were in elementary school. Oh. And Ellie Jansen died of a brain tumor and shocked everybody. Christmas time, we all came back from Christmas holidays and she was gone, and the empty chair in the classroom and the empty place in the choir. I mean, it was just devastating. It was the first funeral I'd ever been to. And so when I called the character Ellie, it just seemed to work for me. And years later, I went to see her family, and her sister was thrilled. And she said, I've thought about watching my sister grow older and grow up in the paper. And she was very happy about it.
Who dominated the industry at the time? Did they, as you entered and the strip took off, did they treat you with the same respect that they treat each other?
Oh, yeah. Everybody my age was great. But there were a bunch of old farts who were just awful.
I have heard these stories, yes. I don't mean about you, but I've heard them. Their behavior is not always the best.
Well, at one point I was actually president of the Cartoonist Association, National Cartoonist Society, and they would draw naked pictures of me as I'm trying to conduct a meeting, right? But I drew a few naked pictures of my own and got back at them. But, it was hard. They kind of preferred that I would make them coffee and serve them tea and, not really run the meeting. But the younger people, those people who all came into it about the same time, my age, we're equal. Even Stephen, I mean, if you can do the job, you're part of the group. And I saw very little, if any, discrimination for anybody, whether, what they did or what their background was, or it was very much a family.
Has it been long enough that you want to identify any of the old farts that we're talking about? I'm sure they've all passed.
I think I'll pass. Some of them are still alive.
Okay, folks, send me an email. I can guess at who most of them are, having been around cartoonists a lot over the years.
He managed everything with such integrity. and such kindness and strength. I mean, Bill Watterson used to call him Mr. Opaque. Because he never let you know that he was on your side, but he never was 100% on the side of the company either. He really kept a lovely balance between us, and for that, all of us are more than grateful.
Was there any...
He reassured and he guided, and he's only a year older than I am, so we were very much the same age, but yet I always thought of him as being my supervisor, right? Which... I don't know, that it was an honor, actually, to work with him. And I don't work well with people I don't respect. So I worked well with Lee.
So it's interesting. One of my best friends and my every other week lunch buddy is Chuck Shepard, who did News of the Weird for...
I love News of the Weird.
Yep, same here. And I think we all miss Chuck writing it.
Oh, yeah.
He was surprised, and you said that Lee was only a year older than you. He was surprised to learn last week that Lee was a year younger than him. He always thought of Lee as being much older than him. How could he not be? He was the guy who guided his career, and so yeah, it's interesting how I think it's probably the silver hair that he had for so long that gave us the impression that maybe he was older than he was.
Yeah, that's true.
Between you, for example, I mean, the most heartbreaking storyline for me had always been the death of Farley. That was just so, I still think of it, and I probably could bring a tear to my eye over that. But there were other things over the years that were maybe a little controversial. Character coming out.
But that was the one that Lee and I worked together on the most. And I wanted to do the story because a friend of mine had been murdered. He was a comedy writer for the CBC in Toronto, Canada, and a great guy. I'd known him since, junior high school, and we were great friends. And he and his partner used to do blackout comedy at Second City in Toronto and at Yuck Yucks, and he was just a great guy. And he gave $40 to a street kid to go get some food and lodging for the night. The kid followed him home, went and got a knife with the $40 and slit his throat. So, and the media and the authorities at the time tended to say, well, there's another predator off the streets when it came to the death of Michael, and for whom the character in the strip that Michael is named, and my son. And I wanted to do a story for Michael Boncourt. I wanted people to know that he was my friend, he was a neighbor, he was somebody's son. And so I talked to Lee quite a bit about this storyline, and I knew that it could only run 4 to 6 weeks because a serious story in a comic strip really doesn't work longer than that. You have to be careful because it is an entertainment medium, so you can't use it as a platform. So it had to be a fairly concise but a realistic story. And he said, well, you might lose a few papers. And I said, how many do you think? And he said, well, 6, 8. And I said, well, I think that's okay. I think if 6 or 8 editors want to stop me, then it's worth it. Well, I lost about 45, 50 papers.
Wow.
Which was shocking. But at the same time, and most of the markets had more than one major paper at the time. Like Vancouver had the Province and the Sun, and the Toronto had the Star, and I can't remember what the other one was. But, when one paper would drop you, the other one would pick you up. So I actually gained papers through the storyline. But Lee and I worked together on this because the backlash was phenomenal. Like the phones rang from 7 in the morning till 11 every night. And I answered everything. I didn't want to defer to the Syndicate. I think a lot of editors thought that I would just put everything through Lee and other people at Universal, but I wanted to confront everybody that wanted to talk to me. And what I discovered was that 90% of the editors were very open-minded, and the big newspapers were happy to run something controversial, but it was the small papers in the small towns where the editors would go to a coffee shop and be assaulted by his readers who didn't like the story. So those were the ones who were the most upset. And I remember one editor saying that his kids had been harassed at school and his dog had been spray painted because he had run this story. Oh, wow. But it's probably the story I'm most proud of.
Understandably, and at that time, it was still not something that was spoken about as widely. Now, it probably wouldn't raise as many eyebrows to do it now, but at the time, it was very controversial.
I think you'd be surprised because the newspaper is still, I love the word bastion of good, clean humor because they want young people to come in and read the paper, and the comics are the first page that the young people read. Kids, I started reading when I was 4 and 5. So they want it to be really the entry-level page for your next generation of readers. And this story did not go down well with a lot of people who did not want to, a lot of readers did not want to explain things to their kids. But on the other hand, we got I say about 3,000 letters. This was before email. So we get boxes and bags of letters. And I took them all to the sociology department. First of all, I answered everything that was not X-rated and ridiculous. And you might get 30 letters from Dear Mr. Jackson. We hate what you did on the Sunday page. And it would be some religious bunch who'd been told by their leader, well, we want you to send all these letters off, but they didn't know who I was or what I did. It was like, all right, sir, you said it, do it. A little cattle call, we'll do it. And so people like that I didn't bother to respond to, but so many letters came from family members who said, I talked to my daughter for the first time today, or a child who said, I came out to my dad, or people saying, I haven't been able to talk to my mother, and for the first time we talked, and it opened up a lot of opportunities for people because it ran for, again, 4 weeks. So every day for 4 weeks, people looked at it and took this journey and realized it was the kid next door. So of the 3,000 letters that I got, 70% were positive. I took them all to the sociology department at the university in North Bay. And of course, they love to analyze everything. So they said 70% is positive. And that 30%, of the 30%, very few people you could talk to on a comfortable conversational level. They were just outraged beyond thought, which is limiting. If you're a human, you got to think. So it was a really interesting story, and there were times when I wished that I hadn't done it because there were threats. People threaten you, your life, and your family, and fortunately, I was living in a small town in northern Canada, and was not likely to be reached by some bozo who'd want to come and throw something at my front door. So
Canadians a little more tolerant than Americans in that way too.
Well, in fact, we lost one Canadian paper. The Halifax Herald dropped me and never picked me up again. So I guess Halifax, surprisingly, the editor, I guess, was most upset.
Even after all these years, they never picked it back up?
No, not even.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And how did the reaction to that storyline compare to, well, the one I mentioned earlier, the death of Farley, the dog?
Well, one thing that you cannot ever guess is what the headline is going to be on the day that your strip starts to run. So I did the story of Farley because he was an old dog and he had to go, and I thought it was a gentle, sweet story. It had some emotion to it. But Farley died on the day of the Oklahoma bombing. Oh, wow. So that headline was overwhelming for everyone. And I think it was the first major terrorism act in North America, and it was tragic. So people did not want to read about the death of a favorite dog on the day that they're reading about this horrific situation. So, and people were angry with me because they assumed that you send the art out on the day that it's published. They don't realize you send it out weeks in advance, 6 weeks dailies, 8 weeks Sundays. And even with the new electronic messaging systems, they still like to have it well in advance, mostly for the coloring and because you're sending stuff to Australia and Bangkok, and they want to be able to edit it there.
Wow. Yeah, just to clarify, people, that was the federal building in Oklahoma, and it turned out that it was an American who did it, Timothy. Wow, I can't think of his last name, but yeah.
Good. I'm glad you can't think of his last name.
Yeah, we don't need to give him credit. Homegrown terrorist.
People should be forgotten.
It was a horrible story. Yeah, that is bad timing. I did not realize that was the day that it fell on. Wow.
Yeah, and when Michael and Deanna got married, the wedding took place right as the Twin Towers were coming down. And I was talking to one of the editors I worked with at United Media, and as I was talking to her, she was saying, there's paper blowing by the windows. The sky is gray. People are screaming. The cars are stopped in the streets. And I was listening to this as it was happening. Was really, and people were angry. Some people were angry that a wedding should take place on such an unhappy day. Other people were saying, thank you for making normal still there for us. We want to see normal at a time when nothing makes sense.
Let's change gears a little bit and talk about the comic strips and the newspaper industry, if we could. Comic strips are entering a pretty tough period of survival with shrinking newspaper space, newspaper consolidation, and papers just shutting down their presses entirely. How does that make you feel after all these years? You have a connection to that industry. How do you feel when you see this happening?
I'm questioning. I'm wondering where all of this talent is going to go, where it's going to be seen. Things change and you can't stop them from changing. I'm sorry that newspapers are going, but even now when I get a regular newspaper, it comes once a week and there's so much paper, I don't know what to do with it. And so I can see why we're going to other media. And it's certainly, I mean, I can sit and read everything on my phone in the morning. I don't need a newspaper, but there's no space for comics necessarily on my phone. So I don't know where we're going. I think
if you can imagine right now that you have an audience of editors and publishers from around North America and maybe around the world, and you could look at them, and what would you want to tell them about the value of continuing to keep comics in their papers and not to shave the comics off as a way to save a few bucks?
I can't tell them because they have to save a few bucks. They have to. They have no choice. And I don't think that it's mean-spiritedness that's made them shrink everything down. It's necessity, right? And that's the reality of today. I think right now we're going through a bit of a revolution, and that people realize that a laptop and an iPad are not the only way to get your information. And I think a lot of books are coming out again. I think paper is going to be there for us always, but I don't think the bookstores are going to close. Just like the microwave didn't kill the conventional oven, right? And radio was not affected much by television. We're going to be working in tandem with the paper products and with publications. Again, I'm going to go to those university students and say, where are we going from here? And I have every sympathy for the editors of magazines and newspapers, the paper stuff that, you do a subscription to. I don't know where they're going either. And I think it's going to be another 10, 15 years of just sheer experiment.
Well, Finberg, who's an old newspaper guy from way back, was curious about when the current rerun of For Better or For Worse reaches the conclusion. Will it start over? What have you set down for this? No idea. When it ends again, there will certainly be some wonderful books out there that if people want to look at the books will be there. But, there's room for someone new. I can't hang on to this piece of real estate forever. I mean, I want to see someone new come in and just knock the socks off me. And I would love to hire that person right now if I could. But it's been a wonderful run. I can't begin to tell you how honored and I don't know, fulfilled I am, because as an artist, you want to have some kind of body of work and legacy, something for your kids to criticize. And what are we going to do with all this paper? Oh my God! Well, when will the current run? When does it reach its conclusion again?
Well, it's about halfway there, I think. Maybe it's only a third. I haven't paid any attention to it.
2008. So the original strip ran for 30 years, approximately?
29. I tried to make it to 30, but it just didn't happen.
Okay, so
part of the problem too was that my marriage dissolved, and you're trying to write about a happy working family when really life is upside down. So for that reason too, I really needed to separate myself from it.
I see. And so so it's been 10 years since you ended, because you ended in 2008. This is 2019. So it's about 11 years. It's got plenty of time to run.
Yeah, it'll run for a while longer. I am very, very lucky.
Okay. So you really didn't, you may never have to deal with the issue but you don't expect it to start over again a third time, I'm guessing. No.
No.
And you surprised me by saying that you actually want to see it. You want to see someone else step into that.
Of course.
That's great.
What a joy. I mean, I'm not the only one. There are other people with these same twisted genes that I have. So where are you? Very nice. And I would be glad to open the doors for anybody who had that skill, Sometimes you don't know you have it until you're challenged to work. And that was me. I had a certain amount of chutzpah at the beginning, thinking I could be funny and send stuff to the paper. But that 20-year contract and Lee Salem, along with it, to help me through that, I hope the next generation has that kind of wonderful opportunity that I had.
You can see the rest of this Lynn Johnston interview in its entirety at my other weekly podcast, MrMedia.com. That's MRmedia.com. So I'm your host, Bob Andelman, and thank you so much for watching. Thanks for listening, and let's talk again next week.
This is E&P Audio, a service of Editor and Publisher Magazine. Since 1884, the authoritative voice of news publishing.